Have you ever wondered how the intricate history of Europe and Africa shaped the world we live in today? Let's embark on a journey back in time to the dawn of interactions between these two continents. In the early eras, around the time of the Roman Empire, Africa was a land of fascination for Europeans. They were captivated by the continent's rich resources and diverse cultures. Trade relations blossomed, with Africa supplying Europe with gold, ivory and other precious commodities. But as time went on, this fascination turned into something darker. The Arab slave trade marked a significant shift in the dynamic between Europe and Africa. This was the beginning of exploitation, as countless Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands to serve as slaves in far-off lands. These early encounters set the stage for a complex and often tumultuous relationship between the two continents. The seeds of exploitation were sown, and the world as we know it began to take shape. As time progressed into the 15th century, Europe began to explore the world, and Africa was not immune to their curiosity. In the heart of this era, known as the Age of Exploration, European nations like Portugal and Spain set sail into the unknown, driven by a thirst for wealth, power, and knowledge. These voyages were fueled by a blend of intellectual curiosity and economic ambition, but their outcomes were far more consequential than the explorers could have ever imagined. Portugal, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, pioneered these explorations. They navigated the African coast, establishing trading posts along the way. This was not just a voyage of discovery, but also an expedition of exploitation. They began to extract Africa's abundant natural resources, from gold and ivory to spices and timber. This extraction was not a fair exchange. It was a systematic plundering of Africa's natural wealth. Following Portugal's lead, Spain too embarked on exploratory voyages, leading to the discovery of the New World. But the New World's demand for labor led to one of the darkest chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands, packed into ships under inhumane conditions, and sold into slavery in the Americas. Their pain and suffering fueled the growth and prosperity of the European colonial powers. This was not just exploration, it was colonization. It was about asserting dominance, about establishing control. It was about extracting wealth and exploiting people. The Europeans didn't just map the African continent, they marked it, claimed it, and exploited it. The Age of Exploration was a time of discovery, of new horizons and new worlds. But for Africa, it was a time of loss. Loss of resources, loss of people, loss of autonomy. It was a time when the continent was opened up to the world, not for mutual benefit, but for exploitation. The Age of Exploration marked the beginning of a deep-seated exploitation of Africa's resources and people. The 19th century ushered in a new era of European involvement in Africa, infamously known as the Scramble for Africa. This period was characterized by a frenzied rush by European powers to claim African territories, driven by the desire to exploit the vast resources the continent had to offer. At the heart of this scramble was the Berlin Conference, held in 1884 to 85. This gathering of 14 European nations, with not a single African representative present, effectively carved up Africa like a grand cake. The borders drawn during this conference disregarded the diverse ethnic and cultural groups that had existed on the continent for centuries. The partitioning was arbitrary, dividing communities and fusing others together, leading to conflicts that still persist today. The scramble was not just about acquiring land, it was about exploiting resources. Europe's industrial revolution was hungry for Africa's raw materials, from gold and diamonds to rubber and ivory. The extraction of these resources was often brutal, with little regard for the welfare of the African people. The impacts on African societies were profound. Traditional systems of governance were disrupted, cultures were suppressed, and populations were subjected to harsh colonial rule. The extraction of resources left many areas impoverished and unable to sustain themselves. The scramble also led to a significant loss of African identity, as European languages, education, and religious practices were imposed. Furthermore, the scramble sparked a wave of resistance movements across Africa. These movements were often met with violent repression, leading to a legacy of conflict and struggle that has shaped the continent's history. The scramble for Africa solidified Europe's stronghold on the continent, leaving a lasting impact on its people and resources. It was a period marked by exploitation and disregard for African sovereignty. It's a chapter of history that serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked greed and the relentless pursuit of power and wealth. The 20th century saw a wave of decolonization, with African nations reclaiming their sovereignty. But was it truly the end of exploitation? Decolonization was a complex and multifaceted process. It was a period of triumph as African nations fought for and won their independence. Yet it was also a time of great turmoil. Many newly independent nations grappled with the task of nation-building in the shadow of their colonial past. Some nations like Ghana led the way, gaining independence as early as 1957. Others followed suit in a domino effect that swept across the continent. But the jubilation of newfound freedom was often tempered by the harsh realities of independence. Post-colonial Africa faced immense challenges. The colonial powers had drawn borders without regard to ethnic or cultural divisions, leading to internal conflict and strife. In many cases, the colonial powers had extracted resources for decades, leaving economies in ruins. The task of building functional, self-sustaining economies was daunting, to say the least. Yet the exploitation did not end with the lowering of the colonial flags. In many ways, it simply changed form. The concept of neo-colonialism emerged, highlighting the continued influence and control of the former colonial powers through economic means. African nations found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt and dependence, forced to rely on foreign aid and loans. These economic chains often came with strings attached, influencing domestic policies and perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. Moreover, multinational corporations, many based in former colonial powers, continued to extract resources, often with little benefit to the local communities. The struggle for true independence continues to this day. Despite many successes and progress, the legacy of colonization and the challenges of neo-colonialism persist. The echoes of exploitation continue to reverberate in Africa's modern struggles. Though the chains of colonization were broken, the echoes of exploitation continue to reverberate in Africa's modern struggles. As we've seen, the story of Europe and Africa is one of exploration, exploitation, and enduring impacts. The initial interactions set the stage for a relationship marked by curiosity, but also the start of exploitation. Then came the age of exploration, a period filled with discoveries, but also the beginning of a more systemic exploitation of Africa's resources. Europe's hunger for wealth and power led to the scramble for Africa, a fierce competition between European powers to claim as much of Africa as possible. This scramble left deep scars on the continent, the effects of which are still palpable today. Decolonization brought a semblance of freedom, but the exploitation didn't end there. The economic structures left behind continue to enable the West's ongoing exploitation, leaving Africa in a constant struggle for true emancipation. Understanding this complex history helps us see the world in a more nuanced way, reminding us that the effects of past actions continue to shape our present and future.